Alrighty, welcome back to this edition of U.S. History. Today we'll be taking a look at 18th century America. And we'll start by taking a look at growth and diversity. Natural reproduction was responsible for most of the growth in colonial America. All you couple that with people living longer, which enabled them to have more kids, along with the people that kept moving in, it created a very young society in America. And according to Divine, in 1700 there was roughly 250,000 inhabitants in the English colonies. And a short 80 years later, by 1780, that had grown to 2.1 million. And if the population continued to grow at that rate, we would be at well over 1 billion in the United States today, whereas we actually stand at a little over 330 million people. And as it worked out back then, the population was roughly doubling every 25 years or so. And one of the first major groups of people to move in here in the 18th century was the Scotch Irish. Now, the Scotch Irish made up the largest group of non English settlers in the 18th century. And even though the earliest Scotch Irish came in the early 1600s, it wasn't until the early 1700s that the first great wave of Scotch Irish, in fact, did come. And when they did settle, they tended to settle in Pennsylvania, and over time would move southward towards Virginia and the Carolinas. And even though some of the Scotch Irish may have migrated due to high rents and religious persecution, most actually simply chose to come and start a new life. And once they did make the trip, many settle in what becomes known as the back country, kind of that western frontier, where there's very few large cities, if any. But because of the overcrowding and high population on the coast, it was oftentimes cheaper and easier to find land out west. However, with that comes conflict and some contact with the natives as well. But when they did come, they were a very independent group of people, tended to migrate as in groups, like family groups, and sometimes even their entire congregations would make the trip together. But like I had said, they tended to settle in the back country of Pennsylvania, and over time move further southward. Another group of settlers that came to America during this time was the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, whereas it's true that they did settle in the Pennsylvania region, it is erroneous to think that they were actually Dutch because they were actually German. Now, they were known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, however, because the German word Deutsch was mistakenly taken for Dutch. Now, whereas these settlers were known for keeping their heritage, their language and customs, the Englishmen in the region actually were concerned that they would eventually overrun Pennsylvania because at first they didn't want to take on the English ways. The English were kind of concerned because of that. However, as time goes on, this becomes less of a concern. Now, these Pennsylvania Dutch were well known for their farming as they were quite successful farmers. And again, just like the Scotch Irish, many times settled in the back country where they could find free and open land to settle on and farm. And for these settlers, family became the primary economic and social unit, with church a close second. Now, whereas the Pennsylvania Dutch and Scotch Irish chose to come to America on their own fruition, another group was actually forced. And this was the roughly 50,000 convicted felons that were sent to America under what becomes known as the Transportation Act, passed in 1718. What this did was it said that these convicted felons, some of which were actually charged with murder and some pretty gruesome felonies, they could escape jail time and even death sentencing if they agreed to be shipped off to America and help populate the colonies. Now, some of these were actually sold into indentured servitude and even some may have escaped and gone back to England. But suffice it to say, you can imagine how the colonists felt about having these felons sent over into their lands. Changing gears now, we'll take a look at what's called the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. And this Age of Reason or Enlightenment refers to 18th century Europe, where we see a dramatic revolution in the sciences, philosophy, politics, and simply society in general. And it actually helped to usher in our modern world as we know it today. These Enlightenment thinkers will have a profound impact, not just on Europe, but on America as well, as many of their beliefs, opinions, writings will be read by our founding fathers and kind of lay the groundwork for what eventually leads to our Declaration of Independence and the establishment of our Constitution. And our first philosopher here, John Locke, had put forth the ideas of the people's inalienable rights, and he said they were life, liberty, and property. And as you probably are aware, we modified that a little bit to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when declaring our independence from England. But Locke also believed that the government had a job to protect people's inalienable rights, and if they didn't, then it was up to the people to overthrow that government and establish a government that would. Something that eventually plays out on July 4th, 1776. Another enlightened thinker that influenced United States history is Montesquieu. It's Montesquieu's writing that kind of lays the groundwork for what eventually becomes our Constitution. In his book, The Spirit of Laws, he talks about checks and balances and separation of powers, and that obviously plays out to our legislative, executive, and judicial branches that we have today. Now, even though Voltaire may never have said it, he's attributed with saying, "I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it." Basically, he was arguing for free speech, something that we hold very dear, and as you're well aware, is in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment. And the last one I just want to introduce you to is Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft was a firm believer in women's rights and said that was through education that women would be able to create equality with that of men. So all these philosophers and many more would have been read and discussed, not just in Europe, but in America as well. And so if we think of some of our enlightened thinkers here in America, you might think about Thomas Jefferson as he authored the Declaration of Independence, perhaps John Adams, our second president, maybe even Thomas Paine on the right side of your screen who penned Common Sense. But the most enlightened thinker and probably most famous man in America and in Europe was Ben Franklin, as he was not only a man of science, but also reason. And his work with lightning rod is, historical, but he's also well known for his political and religious discussions as well. And being that he helped sign many of the important documents that we hold dear to our hearts, he was a very important enlightened thinker for the Americans. Now, if we just turn our attention briefly to colonial trade throughout the 1700s here, what we witness is that the majority of our trade actually takes place with England. More than 50% of what we export in trade is actually with England itself. The West Indies accounts for another 27%. But then there's also a lot of what we call intercoastal trade. And what intercoastal trade is simply just trading along our eastern seaboard ourselves. And besides shipping things by boat, we also created, as you can see, the Great Wagon Road, which ran from Pennsylvania to South Carolina and ran some 750 miles. And what this intercolonial trade did was bring us in contact with each other and create this familiarity and similarity within ourselves. And whereas we might be trading tobacco and rice from the south for perhaps meat or wheat from the north, it was also during this time that a lot of British goods were coming in through New England and being dispersed throughout the colonies, whether it was throughout by the coastal trade or the through the Conestoga wagons moving down the Great Wagon Road that kind of connected the backcountry frontiersmen. It definitely created frequent contact and brought in English culture as more people were able to purchase things to wear and eat and use what the Englishmen were using at that time. However, even with this increase in trade, we don't see these large cities really growing to be all that big, as the five largest cities each had less than 40,000 individuals. And we don't see them growing up into be manufacturing centers, but rather they are served more as depots and places to store goods for trade, which also helped bring in the English culture, which would eventually be spread throughout the colonies through that intercolonial trade. And lastly, here, we'll take a look at what becomes known as the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was this kind of religious revival. Some of the problems kind of included that people had lost touch, with religion, that the clergy had lost touch with the people, the fact that there weren't enough ministers for all the colonies and villages that were spread throughout, the coast. And the Great Awakening has its birth in what's known as Northampton, Massachusetts. And it began in Massachusetts by Jonathan Edwards. Now, he came from a Puritan background with Calvinistic roots, and he had believed that people had become too worldly. And this Great Awakening begins in Massachusetts in the 1730s and spreads throughout the colonies, and by the 1750s spreads down to Virginia. Edwards was probably the greatest Protestant theologian during this time, and his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was given in 1741, where he reminded his followers that salvation was a direct result from God and not accomplished through good deeds or through any other methods. Now, during this time, Edwards and other clergy focused more on those who were already church members. And as they tended to move away from ritual and ceremony, they became more emotional in their preaching. They encouraged introspection and personal morality. Now, even though Edwards is looked as the greatest mind when it came to this great awakening, he wasn't as dynamic as George Whitefield. In 25 years, Whitefield had made 7 trips from England to the American colonies, and he traveled all the way from New England down to the southern colonies. And as he was what was known as an itinerant preacher, one who moved, that's exactly what he did. And he might just stop and preach from a corner in a village, or maybe out in a farm field, gathering perhaps upwards of 20,000 people. But through their emotional preaching, these itinerant preachers were able to kind of refocus people on religion, stress the morality, and really touch them emotionally and kind of personally in their sermons. And so we see the legacy of the Great Awakening as having far reaching consequences. Not only were new colleges created like Princeton, Dartmouth, and Rutgers, which could train new clergymen, but it also encouraged people to take an active role in their own salvation. Furthermore, it not only touched the lives of whites, but of slaves as well, with the encouragement of an afterlife. And then it also connects towns and really makes the Great Awakening a national event as these itinerant preachers moved about the colonies. But most importantly, it probably eventually helps lead to the Revolutionary War as well. Because it encouraged people to speak up and question authority, and not just to sit idly by and accept what they're being told, but to challenge authority and kind of take a more active role in their lives and in their beliefs. So you can see the 18th century America was really transforming time period, which will culminate with the birth of a new nation.